Good evening, everybody. Hope all is well. This is Tim, and this is my submission for assignment 5A. For the purposes of this assignment, I am going to be focusing on international students. I will preface this by saying the reason I didn't submit this prior is I actually burned my tongue pretty bad, so if it sounds like I have a little bit of a lisp, that's why. So just throwing that one out there. But I was very interested in looking at our international student population for a couple of reasons. First off, I think that today international students are becoming more and more involved in campuses. There is a large influx of international students every year. More and more international students are coming to our campuses, all of our campuses, our private campuses, our public campuses, and more recently to some of our vocational schools and two-year programs as well. And also, given the climate today, current events and things that are going on, I think this is a population of students that really needs some focus, that really needs resources, and really needs institutions to recognize what it is that our international population needs in order to be successful in their collegiate experience and what that really entails. So I will first get started just looking at a little bit of a historical perspective on international students, and then go into what I think we as student affairs professionals can do to support these students, and then focus on an article that talks about one specific student in light of some of the things that are happening today and what their experience is, and I think some pretty poignant words that they have to say about what's going on and what we as educators can do for our international population. So looking at our international population, the start of international students attending colleges and universities in the United States started with the Fulbright Act, which was enacted by President Truman in August of 1946. And what this basically did was give foreign students the ability to study in the United States. So to fund students to come from other countries to study in the United States and have the opportunity to go to any of the various institutions of higher education that existed in the country. And initially, this was thought of as being for a set period of time, so it wasn't necessarily an indefinite act, but it was meant to be sort of a let's see how this goes type of thing, and it took off from there. And obviously, since then we've had international students coming into the country. So this landmark legislation that began international students coming in has been huge for colleges and universities nationwide, and accounts for billions of dollars in revenue for colleges and universities when we think about what it is that international students are adding aside from research and aside from the perspectives. I mean, from a financial standpoint, these students obviously are big players in our college and university higher education market. So as I said, this act was signed August 1st, 1946, and less than 20 years later, the number of international students had grown to over 80,000 students. It was 82,045 to be exact, and these were from regions around the world, predominantly coming from Asia, representing the largest population, but again, from various countries around the world. And then this increased just 10 years later, 74 to 75, to over 154,000 students. And then in fast forwarding ahead to 2014, 2015, the number is over 974,000 international students. That's almost 1 million students who are international students on our college campuses. So again, looking at this is a huge, huge number of students that are on our campuses that are coming from various countries across the world. And it accounts for 5% of the student population on United States campuses. So it's definitely something that it puts it into perspective, and you realize how big of an impact these students have, and how much of a population they do make up. I mean, 5% of the student population nationwide is obviously a large number. So when we look at how these students are classified and how they attend or are able to attend institutions of higher education. So they are non-immigrants. So they are not students or individuals who are looking to necessarily become U.S. citizens or seeking citizenship or looking to be long-term residents of the United States. These students are non-immigrants who come over to study specifically. It's called a student visa. Now, some of you may be familiar with it, some may not, but to detail it a little bit more, just to understand the different types of visas that are there. So any student who is coming to study in the United States needs to have a student visa. There are 3 different kinds of visas that can be offered. The first is what's called an F1 visa, and this is a a visa that is primarily for students at degree granting institutions and immersion schools in the United States. So purely intended for students who are coming to obtain a degree or language proficiency in English. There is then the M1 visa. So this is for students who are attending a vocational or non-academic trade school. So I talked about that a little bit earlier, where you're starting to see the international student population not just going to your traditional four-year baccalaureate institutions or graduate schools, but you are seeing international students start to take advantage of some of the vocational and non-academic, more trade-oriented programs that exist nationwide. So I think that's something that we should keep an eye on as well, is what type of number of students are coming into those programs, because that is a whole different type of population that requires some different resources because it is trade and career focused. So just something to keep in mind. And then finally, the J1 visa. What this allows is for short-term visitation or exchange programs. So when you talk about a visiting professor or a visiting lecturer or anyone like that, those are going to be coming over on the J1 visa, or for students who are receiving government funding such as a Fulbright grant or scholarship or something along those lines. So that is your J1. So when we look at populations for international students who are attending schools in the United States, 40% of these students, we had 40% of these students coming over to study. Now, when we look at how there's actually been somewhat of a decline in the early 80s, we saw this number fall to just above 30%. And by the mid-1990s, a slip even further, and then in 2014 to 22%. So we're seeing that while the international students attending higher education, 40% of them coming to the United States in the 80s, that number has decreased. And there's a few reasons why, which I think are important from an admission standpoint to understand, but also from a student affairs standpoint to understand what dynamics exist. So first, we're talking about other Western countries making their international student population offerings more robust and more competition to bring international students to their campuses. So England, Australia, and other English-speaking countries, Western European countries, bringing students over. Also, countries such as China, South Korea, Japan, their higher education systems becoming bolstered and more robust, where they are keeping students who otherwise may have looked to attend a higher education institution in the United States. And then finally, what we've seen as well is, to sort of combat this, is American institutions having satellite campuses or distance campuses in other countries. So there are universities across the country who have campuses in European countries, in Asian countries, in Middle Eastern countries, so that students have the opportunity to attend in their home country or in another country versus having to come all the way to the United States, and also distance learning through online programs and different offerings that provide a virtual academic experience where the students are able to attend the institution without actually being there and without necessarily needing to obtain a visa to be in country. So those dynamics that are existing, I think, are important to look at, because when we think about where our students are coming from and what it is that we need to do to retain them and have them matriculate through our institutions, the competition is becoming more and more. So if students are not necessarily finding the experience they're looking for at our institutions, they do have opportunity elsewhere, where 20, 30 years ago, there were not as many options. So it's definitely something that I think we need to keep in mind. And I talked earlier about the financial implications of international students. So looking at in 2015, the estimated contribution to the U.S. economy 2014 to 2015 of international students was $30.5 billion. So you think about how large of a number that is, and the institutions that are relying on those funds. These are students who are coming in and literally paying billions of dollars, and for a lot of them, they are not eligible for financial aid through the institution. Actually, less than 20% or a little above 20% actually, receiving some form of financial aid from the institution that they are attending. So over 70% of these students are paying out of pocket through family loans and through personal funds. So there is very little financial aid that is available. So a lot of these students coming in are paying full price. So when you think about from a financial standpoint for the institution, the value of these students purely from a financial standpoint is significant because they are going to be paying your full sticker price for your institution in many cases, and even if they are receiving financial aid in some capacity, it is more limited than, or much more limited, significantly more limited than what your traditional domestic students would be receiving. So financially, this is again as a population that if institutions are not putting effort into the resources and offerings and support systems for these students, that forget losing the numbers, the amount of money that's invested that institutions would be losing if these students are not retained or choose not to stay at your institution are definitely significant. So now shifting into what we as educators in student affairs can do for our international students, and what are some of the major areas of stress for our international student population. There's been research out, but what a lot of researchers are determining is that a lot of these numbers or results are coming from isolated groups. So painting a real picture of the majority of international students becomes quite difficult. But there, in our text, you'll see that it does narrow it down to some major sources of stress. So first being those common to anyone that is in a foreign culture. So forget that they are students, whatever it is. Think if you were to just go into another country, what the struggles that you would have would be. The same is true for the international students in terms of coming to a new country, having to learn how things work, having to learn more of the language, even though international students are required to pass an English proficiency exam in order to be accepted to an institution of higher education that's approved by the Department of Homeland Security. Oftentimes they do not have a mastery of the language. So that's something that we need to take into account. Those common to individuals of that age. So just because they are from another country, they are facing very similar challenges to what our domestic students are facing, what young adults face. We've discussed identity as a major thing. These students not only forming their identity from their country, but now their identity as it exists in their new environment in the United States. So that's something we need to keep in mind as well. The academic stress, a lot of these students, again, they are paying full ride to attend our institutions, and the family stress and academic stress that is on them to succeed, especially in order to maintain their status, is significant because if they don't maintain whatever criteria in terms of academic standing is necessary for them to remain in the institution, they not only risk being no longer being able to attend the institution, but they then have to go home. They're not able to stay in the country. So you look at not only the academic rigor of courses and students needing to be able to succeed and putting a tremendous amount of stress on themselves, but also the fear that if they do not succeed academically, they then have to go back to their country and oftentimes are worried about how they would be looked at and viewed by their family and by their peers. And then on the pressure on students to represent their country. And I think this is something that's really, really critical for student affairs professionals to really take into account, is that students need to feel comfortable celebrating their country, their international culture, representing it on campus and having opportunities to celebrate their culture. There are opportunities to engage domestic students in their culture. I think that's one of the tremendous things that international students bring to the table, is they're a whole another source of understanding and global awareness for our domestic students. And I think that from a programmatic standpoint, if we leverage that and work with our international student services departments and work with our student clubs and organizations to really foster an understanding of and celebration of international student cultures and really engage our students in some targeted programming to educate them about not only that we have the international students on campus and broadly what that means, but the individual cultures associated with them, and not just for the large groups of students. You know, there are traditionally hotspots for international students, China, India, South Korea, so on and so on. But every international student's culture should be able to be recognized and celebrated so that they feel a sense of belonging with the institution and with the United States, and also so that our students and our faculty and staff have the opportunity to learn about their various cultures and engage in discussion around them and what it really means to be an international student and what the global perspective is of those students. So I think it's something that's very important for us to recognize. And thinking about what some of the struggles may be from just a social standpoint, these students do not necessarily have a circle of friends that they are coming into the institution with and have to get acclimated to the culture. So their curve in becoming acclimated to the institution is significant. They spent all this time preparing to arrive, but once they arrive is when they get a sense of culture shock. I think if the reverse is true, anytime you go to another country, this sort of idea of culture shock comes into play. And for these students, that's no different. It's just culture shock to our culture. So we need to think about that and understand that while what we see around us is normal for our international students, it is not normal, and it is not what they are accustomed to, and that we have an obligation to make sure that there are resources in place to guide them in the right direction. Also, from a language standpoint, again, even though they have to take an English proficiency exam, their understanding of the language itself and of the traditions itself may not be consistent with what our expectations of understanding are for college students. In Sujay's text, the case study at the end of the international students section looks at a student from China who comes over and in a history class quotes long excerpts from historians and various researchers and does not cite them, does not quote them. The professor comes in and says that the student obviously has significantly plagiarized their work and that they are there are significant ramifications ranging from just a academic probation to being dismissed from the institution, as obviously plagiarism is a big deal, and many institutions have a zero tolerance policy for it. But with this student, the student didn't understand in their culture. They are encouraged to do this, to use the work of philosophers, of researchers, of historians, and in whatever it is that they're discussing and writing, to lend support to it without citing or quoting or providing any kind of citation in any capacity. So you look at that disconnect, and in that situation, what could the institution have had in place to make sure that students understood that? So is it part of their orientation where there's a piece on academic integrity and on exactly what it is the expectations are in the classroom, what it is to cite, why we do it, and engage in that discussion with that student to say, if the student says, well, I'm not accustomed to that, well, let's talk that out. Had that happened, perhaps that situation would have happened. So that's just something to think about in terms of an adaptation perspective to American higher education. The social anxiety and stereotypes that come along with it. We've talked at length in various papers and in texts about the different types of stereotypes and identity issues that are out there. But we've looked a lot at domestic students, and while certainly those exist and are prevalent and systemic in our culture, the same exists for international students, and is essentially could be considered on a larger scale because we are ignorant to their culture and may not necessarily know that we are stereotyping, even though we are. So what type of social experiences might these students have that then lead them to not be happy, to not persist and not matriculate through our institutions, or that lead them to look into alternative, not so good means of coping and other types of issues, and do we have the right counseling programs in place? Do we have the right educational opportunities in place so that students have some place to go when they are perhaps feeling this way, but also the students feel accepted and are immersed in programming that celebrates our culture and also celebrates their culture, and the bridging of both, so that there's a mutual understanding of how similar we all are and what it is that we all bring to the table from our various backgrounds and cultures, and for them from their countries. I've worked with international students with some frequency, especially our international student organization, and these are students who, once you give them the opportunity to have discussions and conversations about their culture, they welcome it. They may not be so quick to start the conversation, but they welcome it. And when you say, hey, well, that sounds great, why don't you program about it? Absolutely, they would love to. But again, you have to have the resources in place to make sure that is possible, that you're not just making an empty offer to these students, that you really have the opportunity to do that. So that's a little bit about what I think we can offer them as student affairs educators and professionals. For my additional resource, I used an article, again, dealing more with current events. And again, this is not from a swaying one political way or the other, but this is an article from the Chronicle of Higher Education from January 26th of this year. And it's entitled as Trump Crackdown Means a Syrian Student in Indiana Worries About His Future. And this looks at a 21-year-old student from Damascus in Syria named Hassan Taqiyuddin, who has actually an interesting relationship with this story. He was first interviewed when Mike Pence was governor of Indiana, and there was talk about a crackdown on Syrian refugees during the whole refugee crisis, that where droves and droves of Syrian refugees were going to Western European countries and coming into the United States. And then, so they interviewed him at that point, and then a year later, following the presidential election, they interviewed him again. And I think that there are some very poignant things that Mr. Adine says in this article that I think talk about the international student experience, and also the need for educators and domestic students and professionals at institutions of higher education in the United States to really take into account and think about in terms of what we're doing in light of these kinds of situations. So one of the first things he said was that if more Americans spoke with Syrians, they would realize how much they have in common. And I think that's really at the core of our international students and their experience, is understanding that they are students. They are the same age for the most part of our students. They are studying many of the similar things as our students, and they're going through the same life experiences. So thinking about that, we're all in this. We're very similar. We just come from a different place, but understanding the similarities that do exist, I think that's somewhat at the core of what our obligation is. And then, when asked if the executive order banning incoming refugees, while it looks at incoming refugees and visitors, he is a current student who does have a visa, worried, and he says absolutely, we don't know what's going to happen. But then he says, think about a U.S. citizen who has never met anyone from those countries included in the ban, and all they hear about is what's in the media. I wouldn't blame them for thinking that all the people from those countries, that we're all dangerous. If anything, the order is just going to make people worried and scared. And looking at that mentality on campuses, and how we then, what are we doing to reassure our students and comfort our students, and have them understand that, while the intent is to keep the country safe, that we're really looking at a very, very, very small percentage of those populations from those countries who are actually engaged in any kind of violent or terrorist acts. And what Mr. Dean goes on to say is that if you're leaving your country against your will and you're coming to another place where you have opportunities to succeed and to move on with your future, you wouldn't pass those up. So putting it into perspective for a lot of these students, this is the opportunity that they have to find something better and create a better life for themselves and become more educated. So we need to make sure that as educators, we are fostering an environment that allows them to do that and allows them to achieve what it is that they want to achieve in the end. And then finally, the Chronicle asks, what, if anything, do you think people within higher education can do to help, in this case, Syrian refugees? And he says, give the voice to the students. Really hear what they have to say, because that's the strongest voice you have. And the people you've admitted to your school and are next to you in classes, hear their perspective. And this, I think, is just a profound statement for us to consider, is that if we give our international students a voice, if we give our international students opportunity, and we give them chances to not just celebrate their culture, but to really have discussion and educate our campus communities about their countries, then by giving them a voice, we are then providing them a platform to excel and to succeed and to celebrate and to merge their culture with our culture, and really collectively, help to create a global understanding for our campus communities, which for many institutions is part of their core mission and part of what really should be delivered to those students. So that's a little bit about international students. I look forward to engaging in further conversation with all of you. I hope all is well, and I will talk to you all soon. Thank you very much. Have a great night.